and welcome to another episode of Expert Speak. Today we'll be discussing on the conflict dynamics in Myanmar, particularly focusing on one state, the Rakhine State in western Myanmar. Rakhine State is strategically located. It shares land border with Bangladesh, and it also has a long coastal line on the Bay of Bengal. If we look at the ethnic composition of Rakhine State, you have the dominant ethnic group, the ethnic Rakhine, and a large minority Muslim community called the Rohingyas. There is also other smaller ethnic groups, including the Kaman, the Chakmas, the Chin, and other ethnic groups. Now, Rakhine State has been seeing a series of violence in the recent years. In fact, in 2017, we saw a military crackdown against the Rohingyas, which sent hundreds of thousands of Rohingyas across the border into Bangladesh. In 2022, we saw the revival or the renewed conflict between the Arakan army and the Myanmar military, which has escalated over the years, in the last 2 years, and the conflict continues there. In fact, to discuss all these issues, we are fortunate to have Dr. Costas Laoutides, who is an associate professor at the International Relations at Deakin University, Australia. Dr. Laoutides is a specialist on separatist conflicts and their resolutions. He has worked extensively on the Rakhine State, the conflict there, and has written extensively books and articles on the subject. Welcome, Dr. Laoutides. And I want to start our conversation on the big picture in Myanmar, which is that we have seen this conflict in Myanmar since the military coup in 2001, escalating in just a matter of 3 years, or about 3 years. We have seen this escalating to a full scale in the entire, covering the entire country. How would you map the evolution of the conflict in Myanmar today, the armed conflict in Myanmar today, since the military coup in 2021?
Thank you, Dr. Yhome. Very glad to be with you today. Thank you for the invitation. I think to begin answering this question, we need to sort of take a step back and think where Myanmar was at just on the eve of the military coup in February 2021. We had elections in November 2020, where the NLD, the political party that Suu Kyi heads, won with a landslide. So there was, if you like, a fear among the military that the whole, if you like, transitions, according to their view, was going the wrong way. So partly the military coup was a response to this increasing strength and increasing popularity of NLD and Suu Kyi in a country that was in what has been called as a democratic transition since 2011. The truth is that in several ways, apart from the devastating effect of the military rule on Rakhine society and Rakhine economy, especially on Myanmar society and Myanmar economy, especially for Rakhine, until recently, the story has been a little bit different. But before going into that, let us just take a snapshot of how the situation is at the moment. So after a very strong and intensive resistance by the Myanmar citizens, there is an armed struggle for the restoration of democracy. And alongside this armed struggle from ethnic Burmese, we have also the ethnic groups that are trying to fight or to continue fighting, as a matter of fact, in order to get more autonomy and recognition. There's a number of them. The most important, if you like, that could be named are the Kachin, the Karen, the Wa, who have already an autonomous region, but most importantly, and lately, since at least 2018, the Arakan army in Rakhine State. As we speak right now, the majority of the territorial control in the country belongs either to the resistance or to ethnic groups. The military is losing ground on a daily basis from fights, and they are at, if you like, a position to fall back and try to reassess the situation. Nobody knows how things are going to evolve. The military is very well known about its strong ideological position and its loyalty to what they call the Myanmar Union. But on the other hand, we can see a number of different groups. Either we talk about the People's Defense Forces, who fight for the restoration of democracy, or the ethnic armies like the Arakan Army or the Karen or the Kachin, who fight for recognition, autonomy, some form, if you like, of extensive autonomy, even independence. So within this jigsaw, I think that at the moment, the Myanmar military is in a weak position, but yet, as I said, it's very difficult to predict what the next phase in this struggle going to be.
Now, I want to come to the Rakhine State, focus on Rakhine State and us. You rightly mentioned that today the junta is losing ground to the resistance forces, and that we see in Rakhine State as well, particularly since November last year. The junta has suffered a series of defeats at the hands of the Arakan army. The Arakan army, as you rightly said, is today controlling, some reports suggest that about 10 of the 17 townships in Rakhine State. Now, there are also reports that suggest that a battle between the Arakan army and the Myanmar military is anticipated in the capital of the Rakhine State, Sitwe. So where do you see the conflict stands as far as Rakhine is concerned between the Arakan army and the Myanmar military today?
Well, the Arakan army is very strong, probably the strongest army at the moment in the whole of Myanmar. They number around, at least to some estimations, they number around 40,000 active troops, plus the auxiliaries. And of course, to that, we need to add the political flank, the United League of Arakan, which provides basic services to citizens in the territories under their control. So altogether, we are talking about a very substantial number of people that participate in this struggle. Apart from those who are members either of the Arakan army or of the United League of Arakan, we need to add the everyday Rakhine people who are very loyal to the Arakan army. So the loyalty basis of Arakan army is pretty wide in Rakhine. The majority of the ethnic Rakhine, and not only ethnic Rakhine, support the aims of this struggle. Partly, we have also some witnesses suggesting that even some Rohingya have joined the Arakan army. Partly, this has to do with the fact that the Arakan army has been extremely cautious and very inclusive in the way that they approach the next day in the history of Arakan. They have been defending an inclusive, autonomous or maybe dependent Arakan, where all communities, including, of course, the Rohingya, would enjoy equality, equal access to political power, the same rights. And they have been trying over the past few years to prove that with their practice, their work. At the moment, as you rightly said, we see that the Arakan army has under its control more than 70% of Rakhine. Earlier this week, I was reading reports that an offensive in Mongdo is about to happen, which is the last big city in North Rakhine. Butetown has already fallen in the hands of the Arakan army. And at the same time, we have seen reports that those people who have left in Sitwe, because the majority of the population has abandoned Sitwe, more than 60%, those who have left are preparing for an offensive by the Arakan army to take over Sitwe as well. So, in a nutshell, they are in a winning streak. They control, if you like, hearts and minds in Arakan. They enjoy very strong loyalty. So, it seems quite difficult for the military junta to control or stop or contain the offensive by the Arakan army. How this is going to end and in what fashion, again, we cannot predict. But at that moment, it seems that the Arakan army has a very strong presence. It gains territory day by day. But the day after, how things are going to unfold after these victories are translated into a consolidated control of the territory is remain to be seen.
In fact, you mentioned about the Rohingyas. Um, since the conscription law was activated earlier this year in February, the involvement of the Rohingyas in the armed conflict in Rakhine State has become more complex, in the sense that both the Myanmar military and the Arakan army are accused of forcefully recruiting Rohingyas as human shields. There are also, as you know, you have pro-military Myanmar military supporters among the Rohingyas. There are also pro Arakan army supporters among the Rohingyas. Now, in that, how do you see the impact of the current armed struggle in the Rakhine State on the relationship between the ethnic Rakhines and the Rohingyas?
Again, we need to take a few steps back in order to see what happened after 2017, after the events and the exodus of 2017. So
Yes.
we had in August, September, October the exodus, 2017 that was, and then in 2018 we have the offensive by the Arakan army, the armed struggle beginning at a large scale by the Arakan army. At that point, we still, and there were back then and still are, around 500,000 Rohingya in Rakhine. It was very interesting, as I said earlier, that the Arakan army has been quite inclusive and quite cautious on how to deal with the intracommunal relations between the Rohingya, the ethnic Rakhine, but also with other smaller communities. What has been achieved was a quite significant degree of social cohesion, given the fact that the armed struggle after 2018 reached a ceasefire in 2020, and then it flared up, as you rightly said, about a few months ago in October, November 2023. So during this, if you like, silent period where there were skirmishes, but there wasn't any major offensive, there has been a lot of effort and has been a lot of work for social cohesion on the ground in Rakhine State. And it seemed that it has been working, given the fact that the Rohingya were allowed to free movement in the territories under the Arakan army's control, something that they never experienced, at least since 2012, when the major contemporary intercommunal tensions began. They have been included in local village-level administrations by the ULA, the political flank of the Arakan army. So gradually, there has been this kind of recognition of, if you want to use an analogy, I'm taking one from Ireland. So there was a parity of esteem, so to speak. So within this environment, within this improved conditions, the Rakhine State turned to be the more peaceful state in Myanmar during the early years of the coup. When the rest of the country was, in conflagration, Rakhine seemed to be the most safe place in the country. Now, the big question is whether the Arakan army will continue to adopt this approach of inclusion and equality towards the Rohingya, even after they consolidate firmly at some point in future their territorial control over Rakhine. And of course, the big question is what is going to happen with the repatriation. From what we know, from conversations that we had on the ground, this is a very big question mark, not only among the Rakhine, but also among the Rohingya who still live in Rakhine. So across the border in Cox's Bazar, we're talking about nearly 1.2 million Rohingya. How they are going to be repatriated, under what conditions, in what time scale, it's a big question mark. Nobody knows. I'm not very optimistic that this is going to happen in the near future. The numbers are big, and the relationships still in Rakhine, very sensitive. Going back to your question about the Rohingya being used both from the military and the Arakan army. Now, given the track record of the Arakan army on being extremely cautious and very quick in handling Rohingya complaints on the ground, to think that the Arakan army is trying to recruit Rohingya by force needs a bit of more evidence. On the other hand, you have the extreme paradox that the military, which until a few years ago in 2017 was trying to push the Rohingya out of the country, now they are trying to recruit them and to use them as part of the military against the Arakan army. I think that indicates, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is accurate and the truth, but that indicates uh, the level of impasse that the Myanmar military has reached. So they're trying to use every possible way in order to contain the offensive by the Arakan army. Also, we need to add to this conversation the presence of a few smaller groups like the ARSA, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, and the RSO, the Rohingya Salvation, I think it's Rohingya Salvation Organization.
Yeah.
I'm not very sure about this acronym. I'm certain
Yes.
about the ARSA.
Yeah.
So both of these have been operating on the border with Bangladesh. There are reports that they have been trying to recruit members from the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar and try to bring them into Rakhine to fight. There have been reports that they have been fighting these two groups against the Arakan army. So the question is, what is their agenda and what they are trying to achieve? Especially with ARSA, I'm a bit more cautious how to approach them, given the fact that, first of all, when they appeared for the first time in 2016, they have been their operations have been the excuse for the first round of violence that preceded the 2017 exodus. So if you recall, in November 2016, there has been another round of violence against Rohingya because ARSA attacked some military posts. And that was the first time that ARSA appeared. Nevertheless, the interesting thing is that ARSA never managed to enjoy popularity among the Rohingya. They are not very popular at all. And even more so, it was quite interesting the way they operated in 2017 with these attacks against military posts, which again provided the excuse for the military to organize the crackdown against the Rohingya in the exodus. Very shortly, just to mention that in 2017, just a few days before the attacks, actually on the eve of the operations by ARSA against the Myanmar military posts, it was the time that the final report of the Kofi Annan Commission would be published.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a few years back, Aung Suu Kyi had entrusted the former United Nations Secretary Kofi Annan with a mandate to investigate the situation in Rakhine State and to provide some guidelines and some policy advice in terms of solutions. So there has been an interim report in February, if I remember correctly, February 2017. So we knew the interim report and we knew that it was very favorable for the Rohingya. Therefore, everybody knew that the final report that was about to release in August would be favorable. Nevertheless, ARSA decided to attack the military posts just on the eve of this release, and essentially turning the situation upside down and offering the perfect excuse for the military junta to crack down on the Rohingya rather than trying to explain the observations in the Annan report, and of course, most importantly, to take action on the recommendations of the Annan report. So for these reasons, I'm not very sure what exactly ARSA is trying to achieve there and whether it works in favor of the Rohingya communities. But the important thing that I need to say is that they don't enjoy support. Even in the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, they are not received well.
Sure, sure. Now, if we look at the relationship between the Arakan army and the NLD, they had a rough phase when the NLD was in the government. It appears that the relationship is on a good note today, especially as at a time when both are facing a common enemy. However, what is not very clear is how the NLD leadership views Arakan Army's political demands. Because as you are aware, Arakan Army has talked about restoring Arakan's sovereignty to the people of Arakan. So, what is the end goal of the Arakan army?
Well, for the Arakan army, the idea is to liberate the Arakan people. Arakan has been an independent kingdom before the arrival of the Burmese, and all that happened before the arrival of the British. So, for something like, if I remember correctly, 40 or 50 years, the Arakan kingdom had been conquered by the Burmese kingdom, and then after that, the British arrived. But always there is this deep historical memory that the Arakan is a distinctive community with a very distinctive history that have been invaded first by the Burmese, then by the British. Also, Rakhine State has been for a very long time the second poorest state in Myanmar. Suffice to say that until 2004 to 2005, wood was the main material to produce power in Rakhine State. There wasn't any electricity in Rakhine. So gradually after 2005, electricity was introduced. Yet, Rakhine has been quite rich in natural resources. There are gas resources, oil resources, which have been exploited by the Myanmar government in cooperation with China. China is the big investor in this space. But the important thing, and something that the ethnic Rakhine has been saying for a very long time, is that a lot of wealth is produced in Rakhine, but not a fraction of this wealth trickles down to the local communities in order to improve their well-being. Also, the ethnic Rakhine have been the strongest ethnic party in the national parliament. Always the Arakan National Party would win whenever there were elections over the past few years. The Arakan National Party would win the highest number of seats among other ethnic parties. And the relation with the National Unity Government and the NLD, of course, is not harmonious at all. They don't believe, like other ethnic groups, that they fight the struggle for democracy. Their fight is about self-determination, is about redefining the polity in Rakhine State, and they want to have a very advanced degree of autonomy or even independence, depending on how things there unfold. They haven't been very specific about the end of this process because, as I said earlier, it's very difficult to predict how things will unfold in Myanmar. However, Arakan Army belongs to the ethnic groups, and altogether, ethnic groups in Myanmar, they fight their own struggle for self-determination rather than the struggle for the restoration of democracy. So within this context, the relationship between the Arakan Army and the National Unity Government are quite elementary. And in fact, I was reading earlier this week or last week that Arakan Army urged the National Unity Government to refrain from any statements associated with the armed struggle by the Arakan Army. So from their perspective, things are quite clear. On the other hand, of course, the National Unity Government has been quite active in producing a new constitution, a new draft constitution, where it tries to transfer the sovereignty of the territories back to the ethnic groups. And in doing so, they're trying to describe that the Union of Myanmar is an agreement between sovereign territories into forming a federation. And this is how the draft constitution is trying to describe the day after the military coup, if and when democracy is restored in Myanmar. Nevertheless, because of the bitter relationship between the NLD and the ethnic groups, there is no trust. And because there is no trust, there is always fear that whatever is promised or whatever is agreed won't be realized.
About the resource-rich state of the Rakhine State. A question that today related to that is, of course, the access to the resources and the revenue generated out of that. So the military, the Myanmar military, is or would continue to ensure that it maintains its control over the Arakan state, to ensure that it has that access to the resources, which also includes the foreign investments. And you mentioned about China. In fact, as you know, both China and India have stakes in that state. Uh, Now, the Arakan army has on several occasions um, stated that they invite foreign investment in Rakhine State, and that they would provide, they would safeguard the projects and the operations of the foreign funded projects there, and also provide safety and security to the personnel. Now, so the question is then, uh, how is this conflict today in Rakhine State impacting the foreign funded projects in Rakhine State, and how is the geopolitical dynamics, uh, emerging or panning out in the state, in Rakhine State?
That's a very good question, and I think this is the question that both the Chinese and the Indian governments have. The question around how certain or how safe is to continue investing in a region where there is an armed struggle. At the moment, we see that the Arakan army uh, has effective control of the territory, but yet is not a formally recognized state. So they cannot enter into any kind, from an international law point of view, if you like, they cannot enter into any kind of agreement because, legally speaking, the Arakan army does not exist. And this is the issue of how the international law treats non-state actors. What we have seen over the past few months is that both China and India are trying in many ways to ensure the safety of their investments. My understanding is that the project the Kaladan project has commenced again. So the remaining road that needs to be built all the way to Mizoram has started again its works under the protection of the Arakan army. So the Indian government did manage to have this kind of agreement. China again has sent a top envoy to Myanmar to discuss about the safety of their investments. But I think that either way, either under the military junta or under the Arakan army, these investments will continue because they're very important for the region anyway. The question is, what kind of revenue will trickle down to the local communities, and what kind of arrangements are going to be there in place in order to ensure that? So from the Arakan, if you like, army point of view, the idea is that they're going to have agreements which will ensure that some of the revenue, at least, will remain with the local communities, or there are going to be opportunities for jobs locally. The military junta doesn't seem to be interested in anything like that. But again, this is yet to be seen. The important element here is how not only the two countries, not only India and China, but largely how the international community is going to engage with a non-state actor like the Arakan army in order to, for example, provide humanitarian assistance. At the moment, the majority of the humanitarian organizations have left Rakhine State, and Rakhine State is in deep need for humanitarian assistance. So, with who are they going to talk, and what kind of agreements are they going to be in place in order to ensure, for example, the delivery of these provisions? And these are thorny issues, thorny questions, which actually makes us think, or we have to think more creatively beyond the boundaries of international law on how to deal with the situation on the ground. It's not an easy task, especially for states. It's not an easy task, but yet this is the reality. And the reality sometimes can be far more challenging than our imagination, if you like.
Well, maybe the last question. Though we don't see any sign of a resolution or end to the conflicts in Rakhine State today, if there's one step that the Rakhine state, the parties involved in the conflict, were to take to find a resolution to the conflict or end the conflict today in Rakhine State, what would you suggest that first step towards that the process of finding a resolution to this issue?
Well, it depends how you approach the issue. If the issue about providing a stable environment and a peaceful environment for the communities in Rakhine State, then probably the international community needs to engage with the Arakan army. Because so far the Arakan army has been off the radar of the international community. It is quite surprising, I have to say, that altogether when we have coverage about the Rohingya, who are the most vulnerable community, without any doubt, yet we have around 400,000 displaced people, ethnic Rakhine displaced at the moment. We have a major humanitarian crisis that involves ethnic Rakhine. Yet there is this, if you like, type of prejudice that promotes only the vulnerability of the Rohingya, which is absolutely important. I don't question that. But my suggestion will be the international community to approach and have a conversation and begin a conversation with the Arakan army, especially if we believe that the presence of the Arakan army is going to be long-term. And of course, by doing that, it will be very important to keep on the table the question of the repatriation of the refugees as well. So if the Arakan army wants to receive greater recognition at the international level, they'll have to think also about how and when and under what circumstances the repatriation of the Rohingya will begin. Now, in that scenario that I have just described, there is no presence of the military junta, which actually begs the question, how far can we go with that? Again, from my point of view, at least for the immediate future, it is important for the international community to engage with the Arakan army positively, and also through this engagement to ensure that the Arakan army will consider seriously and will have a roadmap for the repatriation of the Rohingya. I don't think that any long-term resolution in Rakhine State can leave behind the refugees. The refugees have to return. One way or another, they have to return gradually in stages. I'm not very sure how it's going to happen, but it has to be in the cards. And a way to convince the Arakan army to think seriously about that is the international community to start a conversation with them, which actually will indicate that they are recognized internationally as the key players in the region.
Sure. Dr. Laoutides, it was a pleasure talking to you, and we hope to have you again for our show. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.